They thought they were about to film a joke for social media, but what they didn't realize was that the quiet old woman standing behind lane 7 had once been the most precise shot this range had ever known. The laughter started the moment Margaret Callahan stepped through the glass doors of Ironwood Shooting Club, her sensible sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished concrete floor, her gray cardigan buttoned neatly despite the warm Montana afternoon. Around her, men in custom-fitted tactical vests compared optics worth more than most used trucks, their voices loud, confident, layered with the easy arrogance of people accustomed to admiration. Derek Whitmore, the unofficial star of the club, adjusted his designer ear protection and glanced over his shoulder when he noticed the unfamiliar figure moving toward the sign-in counter. He smirked. "You looking for the quilting class, ma'am?" he called out, not even trying to lower his voice. A few of the others chuckled. Margaret didn't react. She simply signed her name in careful cursive, her handwriting steady, deliberate. The counter attendant hesitated when he saw it, eyes flicking up at her face as if trying to place something half-remembered, but Derek's voice cut through again before recognition could surface. "This isn't a beginner safety seminar," he added, stepping closer, his expensive boots echoing against the floor. "Targets start at 50 yards. Some of us are training for nationals." More laughter followed, sharper this time, phones casually lifted as if capturing proof of the afternoon's entertainment. Margaret finally looked up. Her eyes were pale blue, calm, unreadable. 50 yards, she repeated softly, as if testing the number. "That won't be necessary." The room hummed with amusement. Derek raised an eyebrow. "Oh, planning to set a new senior league record." A ripple of snickers spread across the lanes. Someone muttered, "This is going to be good." Margaret removed her cardigan with unhurried movements and folded it neatly over the back of a chair. Underneath, she wore a simple plaid shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal forearms that were thinner than they once had been, but steady. She selected a standard range rifle without ceremony, checking it with practiced efficiency that went unnoticed by most of the men watching her. Derek leaned against the divider between lanes, arms crossed. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can even hit center mass. At 50 yards, I'll cover your lane fee." He grinned at the others. "Fair deal." Margaret adjusted the scope with small, precise turns. "Let's move it back," she said quietly. 100 yards. For a second, no one spoke. Then the laughter returned, louder than before. "She's serious," someone whispered. Derek shook his head, amused. "Fine. 100 yards. Don't say we didn't warn you." As the target was repositioned, the chatter continued, predictions made, bets half-jokingly exchanged. No one noticed the way Margaret's posture shifted the moment she settled into place, or how the easy tremor of age disappeared from her hands. The fluorescent lights reflected softly off the polished floor. The air felt suddenly thinner, charged with something no one could yet name. They believed they were watching an old woman about to embarrass herself. They had no idea they were about to witness the return of a legend. Margaret settled the stock against her shoulder with a familiarity that felt older than the polished concrete beneath her feet, her cheek resting lightly against the cool surface as though it had been shaped for her alone. And for the first time since she entered the range, the faint tremor in her hands disappeared completely. Derek watched with a half-smile, expecting hesitation, expecting the uncertain, shifting grip of someone out of her depth. But what he saw instead was stillness, the kind of stillness that does not come from confidence alone, but from repetition measured in years rather than weekends. The chatter behind them continued, someone whispering that 100 yards was generous, someone else speculating she might not even find the target through the scope, and Margaret simply exhaled slowly, not dramatically, not theatrically. Just a quiet, controlled breath that seemed to narrow the entire world down to a single, distant circle of paper. She adjusted the elevation dial. By instinct rather than calculation, small precise clicks that Derek did not recognize as expertise because he had never needed to master fundamentals without the assistance of digital aids. "Take your time," he called out, feigning patience. But his tone carried the expectation of failure. Margaret did not respond. She leaned forward slightly, weight balanced, posture aligned, and for a fleeting second her eyes softened, as if something beyond the concrete walls passed through her memory. A wide open landscape, wind moving across tall grass, the disciplined silence. Of early mornings when focus meant everything. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, yet around her a different quiet seemed to form, subtle but noticeable, as if the air itself understood what was coming before the people did. A few phones remained lifted, recording what they believed would be an awkward attempt. Derek glancing sideways at his friends with an amused expression already prepared. Then came the sound, sharp but controlled, echoing briefly across the lanes before fading into the stillness that followed. No one spoke at first. They all looked toward the distant target screen that displayed the impact location. A small red marker blinked into view directly at the center ring. Someone cleared his throat. Derek leaned forward, assuming coincidence. "Lucky shot," he said quickly, the words arriving too fast. Margaret did not acknowledge him. She adjusted nothing this time, merely resetting her stance. Another slow breath, another measured squeeze. The second report carried the same clean precision, and again the screen flashed, the new mark touching the first so closely that the outline overlapped. The murmurs died completely. Even the phones lowered. Derek's smile faded, replaced by a tightening around his eyes. Margaret remained composed, her expression unchanged, as though this was not performance but routine. She lowered the rifle briefly, glancing toward the target distance sign. "Is 100 yards the maximum here?" she asked gently. The question did not sound boastful. It sounded practical. No one laughed now. The room, once loud with casual superiority, felt suspended in a silence that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with dawning realization. For several seconds no one moved, as if the entire range had collectively forgotten how to breathe, and Derek felt the weight of unfamiliar doubt press against his confidence. 100 yards had not been a fluke, not with 2 shots that close, not with hands that steady, and yet pride refused to surrender easily. "We can push it back to 200, he said, forcing a casual tone that did not quite hide the strain beneath it. The range officer hesitated before nodding, adjusting the target. "Carry her farther down the lane until the small white circle looked almost insignificant against the distant backstop." Margaret watched without impatience, her posture relaxed but alert, as though longer distances were not escalation but comfort. Someone in the back whispered that 200 yards required serious skill, that wind drift alone could throw off the alignment, and Derek seized that explanation as a lifeline. "There is a slight cross breeze," he said quickly, glancing at the subtle movement of a hanging flag near the ceiling. "It will not be easy." Margaret offered a faint smile that did not mock him. It simply acknowledged the statement. She raised the rifle again, adjusting her stance with minimal movement, her breathing falling into a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. Inside her mind there was no concrete floor, no fluorescent lighting, no skeptical faces. There was only distance, measurement, patience. Years earlier, long before Derek had ever purchased his first custom optic, she had learned that precision was less about force and more about listening. To the air, to the quiet shift of balance, to the pause between heartbeat and motion. The range felt smaller now, compressed by anticipation. Derek folded his arms again, though the gesture looked less relaxed than before. Several of the men who had been laughing minutes earlier now leaned forward, studying her form with new attention. The shot came without warning, crisp and controlled, and the electronic display took a fraction of a second longer to update at this distance. When it did, the red marker appeared not merely within the scoring ring, but nearly touching the exact center. A low murmur spread through the room. Margaret did not lower the rifle. She adjusted slightly, compensating for what only she seemed to feel, and released another measured shot. Again the screen blinked. Again the mark clustered impossibly close. Derek's jaw tightened. Coincidence was no longer a convincing explanation. The confidence that had filled the range earlier drained. Quietly, replaced by something heavier, Margaret finally stepped back, resting the rifle on the bench with careful respect. "You maintain this facility well," she said gently to the range officer, as if discussing nothing extraordinary. No boast, no raised chin, no demand for acknowledgement. Derek stared at the distant screen, then at her, and for the first time since she had walked through the door, he did not see an elderly visitor. He saw discipline, history, and something far deeper than hobbyist ambition. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent, the kind of silence that forms when arrogance realizes it has misjudged its target. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected, stretching across the polished lanes like a quiet verdict. And it was the range officer who finally moved, clearing his throat as he stepped toward the old wooden counter near the wall where membership records were kept. Derek remained standing beside lane 7, arms no longer crossed, eyes fixed on Margaret as if searching for a tell, some sign that this had been luck layered convincingly on top of age. But Margaret had already slipped her cardigan back on, smoothing the fabric with unhurried care, her expression calm, almost detached from the spectacle she had just created. "Ma'am," the range officer said carefully, his voice different now, respectful in a way it had not been before. "Would you mind signing the guest ledger again?" She looked at him with mild curiosity, but complied, writing her full name clearly this time. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he read it, then shifted toward a framed photograph hanging behind the counter, an older black and white image of a woman standing beside a long rifle, a small plaque beneath it. Derek noticed the movement and followed his gaze. The resemblance was unmistakable. The younger woman in the photograph had darker hair then, but the posture, the steady eyes, the same composed stance were impossible to ignore. "That cannot be," one of the shooters murmured. The range officer stepped closer to the frame and brushed dust from the plaque. "National Long Range Champion, 1983, he read softly. The room felt even smaller now, as if the walls themselves had drawn in to listen. Derek swallowed, his earlier humor gone. "You are Margaret Callahan?" he asked, his voice stripped of sarcasm. She offered a simple nod. "I was," she replied gently. There was no emphasis, no dramatic pause, only quiet acknowledgement. One of the younger shooters stepped forward, disbelief written across his face. "My father used to talk about you," he said, almost apologetically. "He said you could read wind like it was written on paper." Margaret smiled faintly at that, the memory passing through her eyes like sunlight through glass. "It was a long time ago," she said. Derek glanced back at the distant target screen, then at the photograph, then at the woman standing only a few feet away. The confidence he had worn so easily earlier felt suddenly heavy. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, the question more vulnerable than accusatory. Margaret met his gaze without hostility. "You did not ask," she answered. The simplicity of it settled over the group more powerfully than any lecture. The phones that had been raised to record a joke now lowered quietly. No one reached for them again. The laughter from earlier felt distant, almost embarrassing in hindsight. The range officer extended his hand toward her, a gesture of genuine respect. She accepted it with the same steadiness she had shown all afternoon. Derek shifted his weight, searching for words that would restore his composure, but none came. In their place was something unfamiliar yet necessary. Humility. And in that quiet Montana range, beneath fluorescent lights and polished concrete, the true target had never been paper at 200 yards. It had been arrogance itself, and it had just missed completely. The weight of the moment did not dissolve quickly. It settled into the concrete and steel of Ironwood Shooting Club like something permanent. And for the first time since Margaret had stepped inside, no one seemed eager to speak first. Derek finally exhaled, a slow release of pride he had carried for years without question, and stepped forward, not with swagger, but with something steadier. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. There was no laughter now to soften it. Margaret regarded him quietly, her pale blue eyes neither stern nor indulgent, simply attentive. "You assumed," she replied gently, not accusing, not harsh. Derek nodded. "I did," he admitted. "I thought I knew what experience looked like." A faint smile touched her lips. "Experience rarely looks impressive," she said. "It looks ordinary until it is needed." The younger shooters shifted uncomfortably, some staring at the floor, others studying the photograph on the wall again as if memorizing it. One of them stepped closer. "Would you consider giving us some advice?" he asked, hesitant but sincere. Margaret paused, glancing around the range that had once known her name more clearly than the men standing in it now. "Advice is simple," she said. "Listen more than you speak. Measure before you judge. And never confuse expensive equipment with discipline." The words landed softly yet firmly. Derek managed a small, humbled laugh. That last one is going to cost me, he said quietly. Margaret adjusted her cardigan again, preparing to leave as if the afternoon had been nothing more than routine. Skill fades if it is not practiced, she added, turning slightly toward the exit. But character fades faster when it is not protected. The room fell silent once more, not from shock this time, but from reflection. The range officer straightened the framed photograph on the wall with new care. The phones that had been raised earlier were now tucked away, forgotten. Derek extended his hand again, this time without performance. Margaret shook it briefly, her grip steady, her expression kind. "Thank you for the challenge," she said. "It is good to remember." He watched her walk toward the glass doors, her steps measured, unhurried, blending once again into the image of an ordinary older woman leaving a quiet Montana facility. Yet no one in that room would ever see ordinary the same way again. The fluorescent lights hummed as they had all afternoon, but something inside the men who had laughed had shifted. Pride had been recalibrated, assumptions quietly dismantled. And as the door closed behind Margaret Callahan, the range did not feel smaller or quieter, it felt wiser. Because that day, precision had not only struck paper at 200 yards, it had struck something far less visible and far more important. And in the stillness that followed, everyone understood that respect is not demanded by volume or appearance. It is earned through quiet mastery, revealed only when tested. The door closed behind Margaret with a soft click that seemed louder than the echo of any shot fired that afternoon, and for several moments no one inside Ironwood Shooting Club resumed their practice. Derek remained standing near Lane 7, staring at the empty space where she had stood, replaying every word he had spoken since she walked in. The confidence that once filled his posture now felt unfamiliar, replaced by a measured awareness that skill alone does not grant authority. One of the younger shooters finally broke the silence. "I cannot believe we almost turned her into a joke," he said quietly. Derek did not respond immediately. He walked toward the counter instead, studying the photograph again, tracing the engraved year with his eyes. 1983, a time when he had not even been born. The range officer folded his arms and shook his head slowly. "She trained here before most of us knew what this place was," he said. "She helped build its reputation." Derek absorbed that, the weight of legacy settling in where pride once stood. He glanced toward the distant targets, still marked by her precise grouping at 200 yards, and felt something shift permanently. It was not humiliation that lingered, it was perspective. Without another word, he retrieved his own rifle and stepped back into position, but this time there was no performance in his stance, no exaggerated flourish meant for admiration. He adjusted his scope more carefully than usual, breathing slower, remembering the steadiness he had witnessed. Around him the others followed suit, their movements quieter, their conversations subdued. The range that had been loud with ego earlier now carried a different atmosphere, one shaped by reflection. Derek fired a single controlled shot, then lowered the rifle, checking the display without expectation. The result was solid, respectable, yet nowhere near the precision Margaret had demonstrated. Instead of frustration, he nodded, slightly, acknowledging the distance between hobby and mastery. "We have work to do," he said calmly to the others. No one laughed. No one argued. They simply understood. Outside, the Montana sky stretched wide and clear, and Margaret walked toward her modest sedan parked near the gravel lot, her steps steady, unhurried. She paused briefly before opening the car door, glancing back at the building with a quiet expression that held neither regret nor triumph. She had not come to prove anything. She had come because discipline, once learned, never truly fades. As she drove away, the afternoon sun reflected off the windshield, and inside the range a new kind of focus began to take root. Derek lowered his head slightly, not in defeat but in recognition. Arrogance had once filled the space between him and true excellence. Now it had been replaced with humility, and in that shift, something more important than any trophy had been gained, because the most accurate shot fired that day had not only struck a distant target, it had struck assumption itself, leaving behind a room of quieter men who would never again mistake appearance for ability. The next morning Ironwood Shooting Club opened earlier than usual, though no official announcement had been made. Derek arrived before sunrise, the Montana air crisp and cool as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. glancing instinctively toward the framed photograph behind the counter. It seemed different now, not just an old relic of the past, but a reminder of something larger than competition. He switched on the fluorescent lights and walked to lane 7, placing his equipment down with deliberate care. The previous day replayed in his mind, not the embarrassment, but the precision, the calm, the way Margaret had moved without needing applause. One by one the other shooters began to arrive, their greetings quieter than usual, their tone reflective rather than boastful. Someone asked if she might return. No one knew. Yet, her absence felt almost instructive, as if mastery did not require an audience. Derek gathered the group near the counter before practice began. "We are going to start over," he said plainly. "From fundamentals." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no performance. He demonstrated stance and breathing slowly, carefully, the way he had seen her do it, focusing on discipline rather than speed. The younger shooters followed, listening more intently than ever before. Targets were set at moderate distance, not for show but for refinement. Each shot was taken with patience, each correction made without ridicule. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The range no longer echoed with laughter meant to diminish someone else. It carried concentration. At mid-morning the range officer approached Derek with a small envelope. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping he had found in storage, featuring Margaret Callahan after her championship win decades earlier. Derek studied the headline, then taped the clipping beside the photograph on the wall. "Let it stay there," he said. "Not as decoration, but as reminder." Later that afternoon, a modest sedan slowed briefly outside the building before continuing down the road. Whether Margaret noticed the change within those walls, no one could say. She had not come for recognition, and she had not stayed for applause. Yet the lesson she left behind lingered in every controlled breath and steady posture practiced that day. As the sun dipped lower over the Montana hills, Derek stepped back from the firing line and observed the group, no longer measuring himself against others but against the standard he had witnessed. The sound of disciplined practice filled the space, measured and intentional. Humility had replaced arrogance, and respect had replaced mockery. The photograph on the wall seemed to watch over them quietly, not demanding acknowledgement but embodying it. And in that transformed range, excellence was no longer about who could boast the loudest. It was about who could listen, who could learn, and who could carry themselves with quiet mastery even when no one was watching. The legacy Margaret left behind was not written on paper targets alone. It was written in the stillness that now defined Ironwood Shooting Club, a stillness earned through one unforgettable afternoon and one woman who never needed to announce who she was. By the end of the week, Ironwood Shooting Club no longer sounded the way it once had. The sharp laughter that used to echo between lanes had been replaced with quieter conversations about wind direction, breathing patterns, and patience, and Derek noticed the difference every time he unlocked the doors at dawn. Members arrived earlier now, not to show off, but to practice. The photograph of Margaret Callahan and the faded newspaper clipping beside it had become a silent standard no one ignored. New visitors occasionally asked who she was, and instead of dismissive shrugs, they were given the full story, told without exaggeration, told with respect. Derek himself had changed in ways that surprised him. When an older gentleman walked in one afternoon, wearing simple flannel and worn boots, Derek did not assume anything. He greeted him with courtesy and asked what distance he preferred. The others followed his example. Word began to spread, a calm readiness instead of surprise. When Margaret stepped inside, there was no laughter, no raised phones, only respectful nods and a few warm smiles. She glanced at the wall, seeing the photograph cleaned and centered, the clipping carefully framed. Nothing was said at first. Nothing needed to be. Derek approached her with steady composure. "We have been practicing," he said simply. Margaret studied the range, the quieter lanes, the focused posture of the members. She inclined her head slightly. "I can see that," she replied. There was no grand reunion, no applause. She signed the ledger again and selected a lane without ceremony. As she prepared, the others returned to their own practice, not watching for spectacle but working on their form. The atmosphere felt balanced, grounded, and in that steady Montana light, Ironwood Shooting Club stood as quiet proof that sometimes the greatest impact is not measured by noise or recognition, but by the character it reshapes long after. The moment has passed. The afternoon light filtered softly through the high windows of Ironwood Shooting Club as Margaret finished another quiet round at the far lane, her movements steady and unhurried, as though time itself had learned to move at her pace. No one gathered behind her now. No one whispered or waited for spectacle. The respect in the room was unspoken but unmistakable. Derek stood a few lanes over with the youth group from earlier in the week, guiding them through breathing techniques, reminding them that focus begins before the trigger is ever touched. He watched Margaret from a distance, not with disbelief this time, but with gratitude. When she stepped back from the bench and began packing her equipment, he approached without hesitation. "You changed this place," he said quietly. She paused, looking at him with calm curiosity. "No," she replied gently. "You changed it. I only reminded you what it was meant to be." The words settled into him with a clarity that required no defense. Around them, the younger shooters continued practicing, correcting their stance, adjusting their aim, learning patience instead of chasing praise. The photograph on the wall remained centered, not as a trophy, but as testimony. Margaret walked toward the counter and signed the ledger one final time that day, her handwriting as steady as it had been decades earlier. The range officer thanked her softly. She only smiled. As she reached the door, Derek called after her, not loudly, but with sincerity. "Will we see you again?" She considered the question for a moment. "Perhaps," she said. "But do not wait for me to hold yourselves to a higher standard." Then she stepped outside into the wide Montana sky, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Inside, Derek turned back to the range and surveyed the lanes, the focused faces, the quiet discipline. The transformation was not dramatic or loud. It was subtle, rooted in humility. Practice resumed, steady and intentional. The sound that filled the space was no longer shaped by ego, but by effort. Margaret's car disappeared down the open road, blending into the horizon. Without ceremony. Yet her presence remained woven into the culture of the club. Days later, when new members arrived and glanced at the framed photograph, Derek would tell them the story, not to glorify a legend, but to explain a lesson. That skill does not demand attention. That experience often enters quietly. That the measure of a person is not in their appearance, their age, or their gear, but in the steadiness of their character when tested. And in that quiet Montana range, under steady lights and open skies, one truth endured long after the targets were replaced. Respect is not given to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those who prove themselves without ever needing to announce who they are.